On January 24, 1972, two hunters moving through jungle near Talafofo Falls in the southern part of Guam encountered a man in the undergrowth. He was thin. He was wearing clothing he had woven from the bark of pago trees. He was 56 years old and looked older. He had been in that jungle for 27 years and 6 months, surviving on river shrimp, rats, snails, and whatever the tropical forest could provide to a man who had decided not to stop. He was Shoi Yokoy, former Imperial Japanese Army tailor, private first class, and the last Japanese soldier on Guam. When he was returned to Japan, he told reporters he was ashamed to have come back alive. He had felt that shame for 27 years and 6 months and had survived all of it anyway. 18,337 of the men he had come to Guam with died in 21 days in the summer of 1944. He was the one who did not die in those 21 days. 18,337 Japanese dead in 21 days. 1,744 Americans dead. 21 days to destroy a garrison that had spent 32 months building and reinforcing its defenses. 27 years and 6 months for the last surviving soldier to accept that the war was over. I spent 8 hours carefully writing, editing, and researching this story to verify every number and every date exactly right, because the Battle of Guam is the only operation of the Pacific War in which American forces were retaking American territory from an occupying army and liberating American citizens who had been waiting 32 months for them to arrive, and because the title of this video is a statement about what wars actually cost when you count everything. If this story matters to you, like this video. Just like that, that is all. Thank you. Shoi Yokoy had built his shelter underground, in the bank above a stream, using tools he had made himself from bamboo and shell. He had dug the shelter deep enough into the bank that it was not visible from the surface above. He had woven the sleeping mats and the clothing he wore from fiber he stripped from the trunks of pago trees. He had learned to identify every edible plant on the southern portion of Guam, and had catalogued every reliable protein source the jungle provided in that terrain. He sustained this way of living for nearly 3 decades because he had internalized a military code that did not include surrender as an available option. He was not a survival specialist or a trained jungle warfare fighter. He was an army tailor, assigned to a position that needed filling, and he was far more methodically disciplined than anyone who planned the Battle of Guam had calculated any single surviving soldier could remain. He had companions during the initial years after the battle. 2 other soldiers from the Guam garrison had survived the battle and found shelter in the same southern terrain, rather than withdrawing north where the rest of the garrison retreated. The 3 built the underground shelter together and survived together through the remainder of 1944 and through the years and then the decade that followed. In 1964, a sudden flash flood overwhelmed the area near their shelter. Both of Yokoy's companions drowned. He was alone from that point. He remained completely alone for 8 more years after that. He knew with certainty that the war was over. American aircraft had dropped leaflets over the island. American radio broadcasts reached Guam and could be heard. The transformation of Guam into a major American military installation was visible and audible in the changed character of the island around him. He had understood that Japan surrendered in August of 1945. He stayed in the jungle for another 26 years and 5 months after that surrender, because the knowledge that the war was lost had not changed what he understood his fundamental obligation as a soldier to require of him. The 18,337 who died in the battle obeyed the same obligation by dying in it. Yokoy obeyed the same obligation by surviving outside it. The code he had internalized did not distinguish between the 2 outcomes. He had not found a way to reason his way around the obligation. He had found a way to carry it forward into the jungle for 27 years and sustain it. Guam was American territory when Japan took it. It had been American territory since the Treaty of Paris ended the Spanish-American War in 1898, when the island passed from Spanish to American administration as part of the settlement. The indigenous population of Guam, the Chamorro people, had been residents of the island for thousands of years before any European power arrived, and they had been American nationals for more than 4 decades when the Japanese garrison landed in December of 1941. They were not a strategic asset. They were not a military population. They were people who lived on an island that Japan needed, and when Japan took the island, they became the occupied population of an imperial military zone. Japan took Guam on December 10, 1941, 2 days after the attack on Pearl Harbor. The garrison that defended the island was small by deliberate design. American pre-war planning had assessed that Guam could not be defended against a determined Japanese assault, and that the resources required for a serious defense would be wasted when the island fell anyway. The garrison was sized accordingly. It fell in approximately 3 hours. The naval administration that had governed Guam since 1898 departed with whatever personnel could be evacuated. The Chamorro population, American nationals, remained. The Japanese occupation of Guam lasted 32 months. The Japanese military administration renamed the island Omiyajima, meaning Great Shrine Island, and began implementing the structure of imperial occupation. The Chamorro people were required to learn Japanese, to bow to Japanese soldiers, to participate in a civic structure that redefined them as imperial subjects with no standing as anything else. Forced labor on military fortification and construction projects was systematic and broadly applied. Beatings for non-compliance with occupation rules were routine. Executions for resistance or suspected resistance were conducted publicly in some cases and privately in others. The Catholic churches that had served as the centers of Chamorro community life for generations were closed. The specific texture of what 32 months of occupation cost the Chamorro people accumulated in ways that left marks on every family on the island. Property was confiscated for military use. Young men were assigned to labor details, digging and building the defensive positions that would be used against the forces coming to liberate them. The systematic effort to replace Chamorro identity and language with Imperial Japanese equivalents was never fully successful and was never abandoned as an administrative project. In the final weeks before the American fleet appeared offshore in June of 1944, the Japanese garrison relocated the Chamorro civilian population into improvised concentration camps on the stated pretext of protecting them from the battle that was coming. The camps were crowded and undersupplied. The violence that attends a military garrison that understands its situation is ending moved through them with the specific quality of violence that has stopped calculating consequences. When American forces reached the camps, the people inside had experienced what 32 months of occupation, followed by confinement in deteriorating conditions, produced. Lieutenant General Takeshi Takashina commanded the Guam garrison with approximately 19,000 soldiers, centered on the experienced 29th Division that had been transferred from Manchuria, supplemented by a tank regiment, artillery in quantity, and naval infantry. He had 32 months and the labor of the Chamorro population to build his defenses on the western approaches of the island. He used them. The defensive network included artillery emplacements with pre-registered fire on the approach routes, beach obstacles, anti-tank obstacles, cave and tunnel systems, and bunkers. The positions he constructed were engineered to survive sustained naval gunfire. The invasion of Guam was originally scheduled for June 18, 1944, 3 days after the landings on Saipan. The ground forces designated for the Guam assault were in position and ready. On June 15th, Admiral Spruance detected the Japanese fleet under Admiral Ozawa approaching from the Philippine Sea and cancelled the Guam landings to concentrate his carrier forces for the coming naval engagement. The Guam invasion divisions could not wait indefinitely. They were committed to Saipan, which was harder and longer than the planning had assumed. A fresh division, the 77th Infantry from Hawaii, had to be brought forward. The 77th Infantry Division arrived in position on July 15, 1944. The invasion could finally proceed. Between June 15th and July 21st, 5 weeks had passed. During those 5 weeks, the Japanese garrison of Guam was under sustained naval and aerial bombardment, the longest pre-invasion preparation of any Pacific Island assault to that point. Takashina's garrison used those 5 weeks. The defenders identified which positions were surviving the bombardment and which were not. They relocated ammunition to protected positions. They deepened tunnels and reinforced overhead cover. They moved artillery to positions that offered better angles and better protection. The garrison that waited on July 21, 1944, was better prepared for the American assault than the garrison that had been in position on June 15th. The sustained bombardment that was supposed to suppress the garrison had instead given it 5 weeks of detailed information about its own defensive vulnerabilities, along with the time to correct each one. This is the specific paradox of the Turkey shoot's consequences for Guam. The Battle of the Philippine Sea on June 19th and 20th destroyed Japanese carrier aviation as an offensive force and made the Guam landing possible. The delay it caused made the Guam landing more expensive, not in an abstract sense, in the specific sense that the artillery positions above Asan Beach that sank 20 LVTs in the approach on the morning of July 21st had been improved and reinforced during the 5 weeks of bombardment. On July 21, 1944, at 8:28 in the morning, the 3rd Marine Division came ashore at Asan Beach, 1 minute ahead of the planned schedule. Japanese artillery pre-registered on the reef and the approach routes opened fire before the landing craft reached the shore. 20 landing vehicles tracked were hit and sank in the water. The Marines who survived the approach came ashore under direct fire from Chonito Ridge and Bunshu Ridge, the elevated coral formations above the beach that 37 days of naval bombardment had struck repeatedly without silencing. The ridge positions looked down onto the beach at angles that made them extraordinarily effective for defensive fire and extraordinarily difficult to neutralize without infantry assault. 5 miles to the south at Agat Beach, the 1st Provisional Marine Brigade landed simultaneously. The approach casualties were heavier than at Asan. Japanese artillery had been more precisely registered on the southern approach routes. The beach exits were more heavily defended. The 77th Infantry Division, arriving in the assault wave without sufficient amphibious vehicles, waded from the reef edge to the shore in full combat equipment, several hundred yards of open water under fire. The 2 beachheads were not connected. The Japanese still held Apra Harbor between them. The high ground above both landing zones was still contested. The first 4 days after the landing produced nightly Japanese counterattacks against both perimeters. Takashina was watching those counterattacks fail to break the American lines before committing his mobile reserve. The fire support systems the Marines had established in the first 4 days were the difference between the nightly attacks and the mass counterattack. Artillery in registered positions, machine guns with overlapping fields of fire, naval gunfire control teams with the forward units. On the night of July 25th to 26th, Takashina committed what remained. Approximately 3,500 men attacked simultaneously toward the junction between the 3rd Marine Division sector and the 1st Brigade sector. Multiple columns crossed the open ground between the jungle edge and the marine perimeter. Some penetrated the American lines, some reached the beach, some got into the supply areas behind the forward positions. Japanese soldiers were found at dawn in positions well behind what had been the front line at midnight. All of them were dead by morning. The garrison's capacity for coordinated offensive action ended on the morning of July 26th. Takashina was killed 2 days later on July 28th, hit by machine gun fire while moving between positions. Lieutenant General Hideyoshi Obata assumed command of what remained. The remaining defenders withdrew into the mountainous jungle interior of the island's north, trading space for time. The organized battle was over. The unorganized continuation was just beginning. Shoi Yokoy did not go north with the main body. He survived in the south, in terrain he had learned during the battle period, in the specific part of the island where American clearing operations in late 1944 did not find him. He built his shelter. He survived his first year alone, then the second, then the third. Then for 20 more years with 2 companions. Then for 8 more years alone. The garrison was gone. He remained. Major General Roy Geiger declared Guam secure on August 10, 1944. The declaration was accurate in the operational sense that organized Japanese resistance with a coherent command structure had ceased. It was not accurate in the sense that the island was clear of Japanese soldiers. The northern mountains and jungle interior that the retreating garrison had moved into during the final phase of the battle contained thousands of men who had not surrendered and who would not surrender. The clearing operations that began immediately after August 10th proceeded through the rest of 1944 and into the following year. By the time Japan surrendered in August of 1945, more than 8,500 additional Japanese soldiers had been killed or captured on Guam in the period since the battle's official conclusion. The organized battle lasted 21 days. The unorganized continuation, fought through the jungle by patrols hunting holdouts, lasted another full year. The Chamorro people emerged from the hills and the jungle and the concentration camps as the American advance moved inland and north across the island. They came toward the American lines carrying whatever they had managed to preserve through 2.5 years of occupation. They brought critical information. They showed Marine and Army units paths through the terrain that the military maps did not show. They reported Japanese positions. They guided patrols through ground they had known since before any of the soldiers fighting on it had been born. They had been waiting for 32 months. When the moment finally came, they were an active part of it. This was different from every other island battle in the Pacific campaign. Not a position seized from an enemy or a neutral population caught between two armies. The people guiding the American patrols were Americans. They had been Americans since 1898. They had been American nationals through the entire occupation. The intelligence they provided was as accurate as military intelligence gets, because the people providing it had lived immediately adjacent to those Japanese positions for 2.5 years. Fleet Admiral Nimitz transferred the Pacific Fleet headquarters from Pearl Harbor to Guam in January of 1945, 5 months after the island had been declared secure. The harbor at Apra became the forward logistics base for the fleet's advance against Japan's home islands. The airfields became bases for B-29 operations alongside those on Saipan and Tinian. The operational decisions about the final phase of the Pacific War were made and coordinated from Guam as much as from any other location in the theater. The island that Japan had taken in 3 hours in December of 1941 became, within 6 months of its recapture, the nerve center from which the war against Japan was ended. Takashina's counterattack on the night of July 25th failed against a perimeter that had been specifically prepared to receive it. The Marine Corps, by the summer of 1944, had developed beachhead defensive doctrine that prioritized artillery registration above almost every other consideration after the initial landing. The first hours on a defended island were the most dangerous for the landing force. The best insurance against a mass night assault was not additional infantry, but organized artillery with pre-calculated fires covering the routes any counterattack would have to use. 4 days had been sufficient time to establish this capacity across both beachheads. When 3,500 Japanese soldiers advanced from the jungle tree line toward the marine perimeter at 2 in the morning, they crossed the ground that the defensive fires had been specifically calculated to cover. The columns that penetrated the marine line were isolated by first light and reduced through the morning. The Japanese soldiers who reached the beach had crossed the entire American defensive position. They had no force coming behind them, and no means of using what they had gained. What the counterattack accomplished was the elimination of Takashina's ability to conduct any subsequent coordinated defensive response. After July 26th, the defense became a series of fixed positions that the Americans could approach from any direction without facing coherent resistance. Shoi Yokoy had been an army tailor, not a combat specialist. He came to Guam because the garrison needed men to fill positions, and he was one of the men available. He survived the battle in the southern part of the island, rather than withdrawing north with the main body of the retreating garrison. The American clearing operations of late 1944 and early 1945 did not find him. He found hiding places that were deep enough and remote enough to allow him to survive. The 2 soldiers who hid with him in those years were not named in the historical records with the same frequency as Yokoy himself. They died in a flash flood in 1964, 20 years after the battle. Yokoy rebuilt alone. He continued the strict discipline of concealment that had sustained him for 2 decades and applied it for 8 more years by himself. The last confirmed Japanese soldier remaining on any Pacific island after the war ended was an army tailor who had been hiding alone in the southern Guam jungle for 8 consecutive years when the hunters found him in January of 1972. When Shoi Yokoy walked out of the southern Guam jungle near Talofofo Falls on January 24, 1972, he was airlifted back to Japan within days of his discovery. He was received in Japan with the specific intensity of attention that his extreme duration of concealment produced in a culture that was still actively processing the loss of the war he had spent 27 years continuing to fight. Japanese journalists and television cameras met him at the airport in Tokyo. He told them he was ashamed to have returned alive. He had been ashamed for 27 years, and he continued to say so for 25 more years in Japan until he died in 1997 at the age of 82. His return forced the same question that the battle's numbers force. What does an obligation cost when it is carried for 27 years in a jungle after the war that generated it ended? The battle produced those numbers on both sides in exactly 21 days of fighting. Yokoy's survival cost 27 years of a man's life. The accounting that stops at August 10, 1944, when Major General Geiger declared the island secure, is an accounting that omits the thousands of additional Japanese killed or captured in the clearing operations that ran through late 1944 and into 1945. It omits the American patrol casualties sustained in the northern jungle clearing operations through 1945. And it omits Shoi Yokoy. The title of this video says 18,000 dead and the last one in 1972. That is the complete accounting. Hit subscribe right now, because coming up is what Guam became after the battle, why Yokoy knew the war was over and stayed in the jungle anyway, the specific nature of what 32 months of Japanese occupation cost the Chamorro people, and why the turkey shoot that made the Guam landing possible also made it more expensive. Do not go anywhere. The Chamorro people who emerged from the concentration camps and the jungle hiding places as the American advance moved north in August of 1944 were in a specific position that no population on any other Pacific island occupied. They were American nationals by law. They had been American nationals since the Treaty of Paris that ended the Spanish-American War in 1898. They had been American nationals through every single day of the 32 months of Japanese occupation, through every day they spent confined in the concentration camps, through every day they spent hiding in the hills and the jungle above the occupied island. The legal fact of their American nationality had not changed at any point during the occupation. Its practical value for protecting them during the occupation had been zero. What the American nationality meant in practice during the occupation was the specific quality of the Japanese effort to eliminate it. The occupation was not simply a military administration imposed on a neutral civilian population. It was a deliberate effort to replace what the Chamorro people understood themselves to be with what the imperial administrative system required them to become. The administrative renaming of the island from Guam to Omiyajima was the formal signal of that effort. The forced instruction in the Japanese language was the implementation of that replacement. The beating of Chamorro people who did not bow sufficiently to Japanese soldiers was the enforcement mechanism. The closing of the Catholic churches that served as the institutional center of Chamorro community life was the attempt to remove it. None of it worked as completely as the occupation administration had intended. The Chamorro people maintained their identity through the 32 months, not through organized resistance in any military sense, but through the specific stubbornness that a population maintains when what is being demanded of it is the total abandonment of everything it has ever understood itself to be. When American forces arrived in July of 1944, the Chamorro people who emerged from hiding were not a traumatized and passive civilian population. They were people who had been actively maintaining their American identity in secret for 32 months and who were now completely prepared to make that identity operationally useful to the forces coming to liberate them. The formal testimony that Chamorro people gave to American military intelligence and civil affairs officers in August and September of 1944 produced the most complete documentary record available of what 32 months of Japanese military occupation had specifically and systematically cost: the forced labor on fortification projects, the specific incidents of execution, the concentration camps in the final weeks, and what the conditions in those camps had been, The testimony was systematic, specific, and detailed, because the occupation had been systematic, specific, and detailed in its methods. The Chamorro people described what the Japanese military administration had done to them with the precision of people who had been keeping a careful mental record, precisely because they had known this day would eventually come. The question of what the occupation cost in terms that no casualty figure captures is the question that the testimony raised without fully answering. The number of Chamorro people killed during the occupation is documented. The number of families whose property was confiscated is documented. The number of people assigned to labor details is documented. What no casualty figure or official count captures is the accumulated weight of 32 months spent maintaining a collective identity under an administrative system specifically designed to eliminate it, or what it cost the Chamorro community emotionally and socially to watch their young men digging under orders they could not refuse. The defensive positions the garrison would use when the Americans finally arrived. Shoi Yokoy had been aware of the presence of the Chamorro population during his years in the southern jungle. He had carefully avoided any contact with the local population that might reveal his position to the American authorities. The Chamorro people who lived on the island through the period of his concealment knew about the Japanese holdouts from the discussion of sightings and the occasional encounters that produced the records of the clearing operations. The relationship between the former occupying force and the people it had occupied, conducted through avoidance rather than contact in the jungle of an island that had been American territory for the entire duration, is one of the stranger elements of the 27-year story that Yokoy's survival represents. The full strategic consequence of Guam's capture was not yet fully visible to anyone in August of 1944. It became visible in January of 1945, when Admiral Nimitz moved his Pacific Fleet headquarters to Guam in January of 1945. The harbor at Apra was the finest natural anchorage in the Western Pacific, and it became the forward gathering point for the fleet's advance against the Japanese home islands. The airfields that the Japanese garrison had constructed during the 32 months of occupation, using Chamorro forced labor, became operational B-29 superfortress bases. The island that Japan had taken to use as a forward base became the platform from which the United States ended the war. The connection between the Chamorro forced labor that built the Guam airfields during the occupation and the American B-29 operations that used them to bomb Japan is one of the more specific ironies of the entire Pacific War. The Chamorro men who had been assigned to labor details on those construction projects were not building the airfields for Japan's strategic benefit. They were building them because, under the occupation, refusal was not available as an option. The airfields they built under compulsion were ultimately used by the American forces that defeated the military that had compelled them to build those same airfields. December 10th, 1941. Japan takes Guam in 3 hours of fighting against a deliberately undersized American garrison. 32 months of occupation begin immediately. June 15th, 1944. Spruance cancels the June 18th Guam landing. The fleet concentrates for the naval engagement. The Guam garrison spends 5 more weeks improving its defenses under sustained bombardment. June 19th and 20th, Battle of the Philippine Sea. Japanese carrier aviation is destroyed in the Turkey Shoot. The naval victory makes the Guam landing possible. The 5-week delay it causes makes the Guam landing more expensive. July 21st, 8:28 a.m. Simultaneous landings at Asan Beach and Agat Beach. 20 LVTs sunk in the approach before reaching shore. Chonito Ridge and Bunchu Ridge positions remain active after 37 days of bombardment. Night of July 25th to 26th. Takashina commits his entire mobile reserve, approximately 3,500 men, to the decisive counterattack. All are dead by morning. The garrison's mobile reserve is eliminated. July 28th. Takashina killed by machine gun fire on July 28th. Lieutenant General Hideyoshi Obata assumes command of the remaining garrison. The survivors withdraw north into the mountainous and heavily jungled interior of the island. August 10th, 1944. Geiger declares Guam secure. The organized garrison is gone. 1,744 Americans dead. 21 days of fighting. August through December 1944. Clearing operations. The post-battle operations produced thousands of additional Japanese dead or captured. American patrols suffer casualties. January 1945. Fleet Admiral Nimitz establishes Pacific Fleet headquarters on Guam. August 15, 1945. Japan surrenders formally. Information reaches Guam through leaflets, radio, and other channels. Most holdouts surrender or are captured in the months following. Yokoy remains in concealment in the southern jungle, fully aware of the surrender and choosing to remain in the jungle. 1964. A sudden flash flood in the area near the shelter kills both of Yokoy's companions. He rebuilds his underground shelter alone and continues his concealment independently. January 24, 1972. Two hunters encounter Yokoy near Talafofo Falls, in the jungle south of the island's center. He has been in the southern Guam jungle for 27 years and 6 months without any contact with the outside world. 1997. Yokoy dies in Japan at the age of 82. 25 years after walking out of the jungle, 4 factors explain the course and cost of the Battle of Guam, the scale of the garrison and the quality of its preparation, the paradox of the turkey shoot, the July 25th counterattack and what it cost the Japanese defensive capacity, and the Chamorro contribution to the battle's final phase. The first factor was the garrison scale. Guam was the largest island in the Marianas and the best harbor in the Western Pacific. Japan assigned approximately 19,000 soldiers, with the experienced 29th Division from Manchuria at its core, to its defense. This was a substantially larger force than the garrisons that had defended Saipan or Tinian. Takashina had 32 months and the forced labor of the Chamorro population to construct and refine his defensive network. The cost of 1,744 American dead reflected what 19,000 soldiers, with 32 months of preparation, forced Chamorro labor, and the 5 additional weeks of bombardment informed defensive improvement, had built on a geographically complex island. The second factor was the turkey shoots paradox. The Battle of the Philippine Sea eliminated Japanese carrier aviation and made the Guam landing operationally feasible. The cancellation of the original June 18th landing date that Spruance's decision required gave Takashina's garrison 5 additional weeks under bombardment. Those 5 weeks were not passive. The garrison used the bombardment as information, identifying which positions were surviving the naval gunfire and which were not, reinforcing the survivors, relocating ammunition, deepening tunnels. The positions that sank 20 LVTs when the Marines landed on July 21st were stronger than they had been on June 15th. The greatest American naval victory of the Pacific War to that point made the next American ground assault measurably more expensive. The third factor was the July 25th counterattack. Takashina's operational decision to commit his entire mobile reserve to a single night assault was the decision that ultimately determined the campaign's duration and its final cost. A successful counterattack would have driven the Marines back toward the beach and the water and reset the entire tactical situation. The counterattack failed completely and immediately. 3,500 men died in a single night. The garrison lost permanently its capacity to respond to American pressure at more than one point along the line simultaneously. After July 26th, the battle became a series of fixed positions being reduced one by one, a process that clearly favored the force with air support, naval gunfire, and a continuous supply chain rather than the force that had spent its mobile reserves in a single night. The fourth factor was the Chamorro intelligence contribution. The specific accuracy of the information the Chamorro people provided to American patrol units in August of 1944 gave those units knowledge of the ground that no military map produced from aerial photography could provide. They knew which trails went where, they knew which ravines led toward Japanese positions and which led to dead ends and impassable terrain. They knew the landscape of Guam the way people know the place where they were born and where they grew up. This knowledge was not a minor supplement to the battle's final phase. It was exactly the kind of intelligence that determines whether patrols reach their objectives or walk into prepared ambush positions. The Chamorro people, who were American nationals, guiding American Marine and Army units through the terrain their families had lived on for generations, were not auxiliary or secondary to the American effort on Guam. They were a direct, documented, and essential part of it. The paradox at the center of the Battle of Guam is not subtle, but it is worth stating precisely. The title says 18,337 dead in 21 days. The last one left the island 27 years and 6 months after the first Marines landed. He told reporters the same thing he had repeated in his own mind for 27 years. He had carried that shame for 27 years in a jungle, eating what the forest provided, maintaining the discipline of concealment alone for 8 of those years after his companions died in a flood. The code that produced the deaths of the garrison in those 21 days of fighting in 1944 also produced Yokoy's 27 years in the jungle. The code did not distinguish between the two forms of compliance. It did not distinguish between the two forms of compliance. Dying in the battle and surviving the battle in concealment in the jungle for 27 years were both ways of not surrendering. Yokoy did not consider himself a survivor of anything. He considered himself a man who had failed to die at the moment he was supposed to. He was, by any external or historical measure, almost certainly wrong about that. But the framework he had lived inside for 27 years in the jungle of an island he had been sent to defend offered him no alternative interpretation of what his survival meant. The island that Japan seized in December of 1941 and lost in 21 days in 1944 held one soldier in the southern jungle for 27 more years. The battle ended officially on August 10, 1944, when Geiger made his public declaration of the island secured. The battle ended actually on January 24, 1972, in the jungle near Talafofo Falls, when Shoi Yokoy walked out and told the hunters he was ashamed to have survived. Guam is American territory today as it was in December of 1941. The Chamorro people are American citizens today as they were in December of 1941 when Japan arrived, and as they remained legally and in their own understanding through every day of the 32 months they waited for the return of American forces. The War in the Pacific National Historical Park preserves sites related to the campaign at multiple locations across the island. Asan Beach, where the 3rd Marine Division came ashore on July 21st, is accessible from the park unit that overlooks the landing zone. The coral ridges above the beach, where Takashina's artillery positions overlooked the landing zone, are part of the same park area. The coral reef is still there at the approach at roughly the same depth it was on the morning of July 21st. The coral ridges where Takashina's artillery positions had been constructed into the rock above the landing zone are still there, heavily overgrown and weathered across 8 decades, but identifiable to anyone who knows what to look for. The underground shelter that Shoi Yokoy constructed near Talafofo Falls has been reconstructed as an accessible exhibit that allows visitors to see the dimensions of the concealment he maintained for nearly 3 decades. The jungle area of southern Guam, where he lived for 27 years and 6 months, is now a local tourist destination with marked trails. This is what happens to the places where history produces its most extreme outcomes. The landscape absorbs the events, opens itself to visitors, and the visitors walk through terrain that the official casualty figures and the battle dates on timelines cannot begin to fully describe. Subscribe to this channel right now and turn on notifications, because every week we bring you the stories, the histories, reduced to a ratio and a date, without telling you that the island the Marines were retaking was legally and historically American territory, with American citizens who had spent 32 months under occupation waiting for this, and who guided American patrols through terrain they had lived on since before any Marine fighting on it had been born. That the specific Battle of Guam in July of 1944 was made more expensive by the same naval victory that made it operationally possible that the Chamorro men who dug Japanese defensive positions under occupation labor were among those who guided American forces through that same terrain in the days after the landings, or that the last Japanese soldier on Guam was there for 27 years, maintaining concealment in the jungle near Talafofo Falls until the hunters found him. Hey, hit subscribe, then like so this story reaches the people who should understand what 18,000 dead in 21 days and 1 man alone in a jungle for 27 years together mean about what wars actually demand from the people they involve when you count every year and every obligation. Drop a comment below and tell us where you are watching from today. We will see you in the next one.